Yeah, the official countdown. Cool. So let me just check it's working on Twitter. Sweet. We are good to go. I reckon maybe let's give it a couple of minutes and then we can properly dive in.
Okay.
I'll do a full intro. It'll be great.
Awesome. Oh, that's cool. There's like a chat.
Cool. I can see some eyeballs in the audience, so we'll maybe give it 30 more seconds and then we can dive in.
Awesome.
All right. I think we're good to start. If you are.
I am. Yep, I'm ready.
Awesome. So we've got Dan here today from Graypoint, who's going to be going through OpSec fundamentals, running us through kind of end-to-end everything that we need to know. And as kind of mentioned in the last session, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the post and I will pass them over to Dan. I'll let Dan take it away now.
All right, everybody. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about operational security, just general security practices that you can implement to protect yourself online. So let's get into it. So I like to start presentations like this with just like, hey, if you only have 60 seconds and you've got somewhere to go, you don't want to sit through an hour-long presentation. Everything you need to know is essentially on this slide. If you take these 4 steps, you can counter a lot of the threats that you may face. So the first one is going to be using hardware-based multi-factor authentication on every account you care about. The second one being reviewing your recovery methods for every account you care about. That means evaluating something like your recovery email, your recovery phone numbers. Make sure you know what is tied to what account and make sure that you have something like MFA applied to those accounts as well. The third one is really keeping your operating system and browser up to date. While it isn't as common to see people using exploits and vulnerabilities targeting you, it happens often enough that you should keep things up to date, especially your operating system and especially your browser. Other applications you want to keep up to date as well. You want to make sure you have everything up to date, but specifically your operating system and specifically your browser are two service areas where there are often vulnerabilities that vendors are pretty quick to patch, whether that's Google with Chrome and the Chromium code base or Apple with iOS. So the faster that you update those things, the better you are, or the more likely you are to be protected. And then lastly, using an anti-malware solution. If you do get exploited by one of those solutions, specifically on your main computing device, your desktop, you want to make sure you have an anti-malware solution. So that's kind of like at a high level, those are the kind of the recommendations that are going to come out of this presentation. We're going to kind of dig into why you want these things. But when I think about what are the steps that an average person can take to protect themselves, these are really the big 4. And I would say that top one is kind of really the best one. Making sure that you have multi-factor authentication on accounts that you care about goes a long way towards making sure that you're not the victim of an attack from attackers who are not going to put in a lot of effort into it. And even for attackers who are going to put a lot of effort into it, the more that you have something like phishing resistant MFA or hardware-based MFA, the less likely it is that they will be successful in targeting you. To kind of start, I think the biggest thing with security is really just understanding that it's a constant tug of war between you and the attackers who are trying to target you. So going to some ancient wisdom from Sun Tzu, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not feel the result of 100 battles. Really, when I think about security, it really does come down to understanding a little bit about what attackers are going to do to target you, but also understanding mostly about yourself. The attacker has the benefit of time, and they have the benefit of it is their focus to target you. And so maybe their full-time job is to target you and to get something out of you, whereas it's not your full-time job to worry about the attacker coming for you. So there's a bit of a mismatch there in terms of the time that you can spend. But the advantage that you have over the attacker is that you have omniscience sort of about yourself and about your environment and about what should be the true state. So when you think about how to counter the adversaries that may be out there that are going to spend all of their time looking to target you, just understand that the benefit you have is that you know yourself. You know what things should look like for yourself. You know what right looks like. You know what a clean state is. And so understanding a little bit of both sides of that will help you to be productive. When we think about what attackers are after and understanding the enemy, in terms that know your enemy, there's really three things that attackers that are targeting most users are looking for. They're either looking to get money from you, they're either looking to get data from you, or they're looking to get access. Access really meaning you are in between them and something that they need. So maybe they can't target something directly, but you happen to have a relationship with someone, or maybe you have access to something that they can get to through you. So you're not necessarily the direct target, but as a link in that chain, you're a target. Those are kind of the big three things that attackers are going to be looking for. Whether you are a government employee, whether you are an employee at a crypto project, whether you are at a charity, if someone is going to try to target you from a cybersecurity perspective or online, these are probably the big three things that they're going to be looking for. They're going to be looking to get money from you, especially when you're talking about Web3 and you have North Korean state actors that are looking to steal funds. If you talk about ransomware actors, they're looking to get data to see whether they can sell that data directly or use it to ransom you or your organization. And in terms of targeting larger organizations, a lot of times you'll see attackers and criminal groups like Lapsus and other attackers, they'll use middlemen. So they'll use people for their relationships and associations with other organizations and people. How do they get in? So we know what they're looking for. We know that they're looking to get access to either funds or data or access, but how do they get to you? So these are, in 2023, the top initial access vectors, and we'll sort of go through these one by one. The biggest one really is phishing. That's where someone sends some kind of crafted lure or some kind of crafted method to deceive you into clicking on something or taking some action. But that's going to be valid accounts. Basically, someone has a legitimate account and their password gets compromised in some way, and someone can just use that legitimate account. I would also use this example for if you are the middleman for something. If they can get you to do something as the legitimate person to initiate an action, then it will seem legit to anyone who is looking at that from the outside. And then sort of the less common ones really deal more with like basic application security, and that's where things like keeping your OS up to date and anti-malware come into play. But we'll go through all of these in sort of reverse order from the least common to the most common. So starting with drive-by compromise, these bottom two were replication through removable media, and drive-by compromise, but I'm going to kind of lump them together. So the first one being removable media. If you find the USB on the ground, don't pick it up and then stick it into your computer, or certainly don't pick it up and stick it into a computer that you care about. Probably a common example that people may have heard of is Stuxnet. The people who've investigated the Stuxnet incident have described that USBs were allegedly left out in places that people could get them, and then they took those USBs into their offices and they plugged those in, and that was kind of the start of the chain. I would say, as a general rule, just don't pick up devices that you don't trust outside, or don't take devices that you're given. Even maybe you go to a conference and someone is handing out, "Hey, here's a bunch of goodies on a USB drive." It's fine to take those things, but if you are worried that there may be some kind of malware, don't just go plug that right into your machine that you care about. Maybe have a separate device that you use for analyzing those kinds of things, or make sure you have a friend maybe who is savvy with those things to run it by. The other one is not reliant on USBs or anything physical, but in 2021, Project Zero identified a wider watering hole attack. So what that basically means is you just have a sort of normal website, and on that website is malicious code that will exploit users using in that case a series of 0 days. But essentially, it's anyone could navigate to that website. It was a popular website. The idea was that the people they were targeting would navigate to it, and then using a set of heuristics that the threat group had built. If you visited and you were in a targeted group, then you would get the exploit payload delivered to your device. If you weren't in that targeted group, you wouldn't get that exploit payload. But that's kind of an example of drive-by compromise. It's not so much targeted in the sense that they're going to try to craft a way to come after you, but maybe they'll leave something somewhere where, hey, if you come across this and you're not careful and you're part of a group that they're targeting, you may end up getting exploited.
Can I ask a question, Dan?
Sure.
On the physical example with the USB, is something like QR codes, is this kind of lumped in to this category?
Yes. Okay. You could potentially see a scenario where someone litters a bunch of QR codes somewhere, and then with the hopes that people will scan them. I think you saw some of this during a lot of during COVID-19 lockdowns. You saw a lot of restaurants and whatnot switch to, hey, there's a QR code menu, a lot of QR codes in just lots of places. So you may have gotten into the habit of going into an establishment and there are QR codes. There's kind of that question of, how do you know that the QR code on the table is the one that was put there by the establishment, or maybe someone else put that there? But that is definitely an example where, don't necessarily go scanning malicious QR codes. I do think that that's not as big a concern as well, it's not as likely to be a concern as the USB one, I think, just because if you find a malicious USB on the ground, or you find a USB on the ground, that's probably much more suspicious than your average QR code. I wouldn't necessarily want people to go around fearing QR codes. And the other thing is that the attack chain from a QR code based mechanism, if it's going to start there, it's probably going to rely on something like in that second example where there's a browser exploit that's relied upon anyway, because that QR code ultimately is just going to open up a browser. The solutions to these obviously are the big solution in terms of the physical case is really like an anti-malware solution. A lot of anti-malware solutions do have the ability to restrict functionality of USBs. They're also more or less good at tracking threats delivered via USB because of the mechanisms that those kinds of threats need to activate in order to be successful. And the other one would be keeping your software up to date. When Project Zero is finding these things, especially when they're reporting on them, they usually work with the vendors to make sure that those vulnerabilities are patched. So a lot of iOS updates, if you see an iOS update where it mentions something security related, you really do want to apply that as soon as possible, because Apple's pretty good at keeping ahead of, hey, this is being exploited in the wild. Let's push out a patch so that users are not going to be exploited by it. Another example I'll add here that is maybe a bit more extreme, but enabling lockdown mode if you're on an Apple device as well can go a long way towards mitigating the risk from a drag download type of attack. The next category on that list of initial access categories was external remote services. So this applies more to organizations than individuals. But essentially, if you are an organization, you want to make sure that you are aware of access methods or services that you have externally exposed. In 2021, Colonial Pipeline was attacked by a ransomware group. They gained access to VPN credentials. So there were sort of two parts. Somewhere they found exposed credentials to that VPN, and either that user was active, maybe they weren't active, but they certainly didn't have multi-factor authentication, and a group was able to use those credentials to gain access to that VPN and then wreak havoc on the Colonial Pipeline, which resulted in that pipeline, I think, for some period of time shutting down their operations. And so what would have helped that? Probably multi-factor authentication against that VPN endpoint. Arguably, they also shouldn't have had it. They probably could have had better controls around how widely exposed it was. But if they have employees working all over the globe that need that VPN access, then it would be reasonable for that to be exposed. However, you'd want to make sure that you also have something like multi-factor to prevent the scenario where someone steals that password and isn't able to get in with that VPN. Exploiting public facing applications. Again, this probably applies more to organizations and to companies with products. I'd say the analog for your average user really is just keeping your software up to date. But within the past couple of weeks, actually, some security researchers identified a vulnerability in vendors to the TSA, where a simple SQL injection, which is basically just a method to compromise web applications, allowed them to get into the management portal for credentials for TSA employees at airports. So theoretically, you could use that vulnerability to add yourself as a TSA employee, and then you could create your own badge, which would be legitimate in that system, and walk into the airport and bypass whatever security measures that badge allows you to access simply from a vulnerability. Again, in the average user's case, you're probably not writing custom code that you're deploying on your home network to and exposing to the world. But this is an example where if you work at a company, for instance, if you work at one of those companies and you are a middleman to the TSA, maybe you might be targeted because your company has that relationship with the TSA. In the case of this application, it really is just a matter of applying some basic checks, making sure that they are doing actual testing for vulnerabilities in their application. The vulnerabilities that were in this application were fairly simple and probably would have been caught if they were looking at all. So it suggests they just weren't looking for them. For an average user, the takeaway from this is make sure that you're just keeping your software up to date so that you're able to make sure that you're not being exploited by vulnerabilities like this. Valid accounts was the second biggest category on that pie. And so recently, between 2021 and 2022, there was the Lapsus group, which is sort of a amorphous group of folks, anywhere from like kids in Europe and, younger people, let's say early 20s age people who were just kind of wreaking havoc on the internet. And they were responsible for a number of hacks like Okta, NVIDIA, Uber, Brazil's Ministry of Health. Their primary technique was really social engineering and phishing. And so, they'd call someone up and say, hey, can you do something for us? Or they would have people who were affiliated with them where they would, say, walk into a carrier store and pretend to be someone else in order to accomplish a SIM swap. So this is really getting someone to use a valid account on their valid access or gaining access to that valid account in order to take some kind of follow-on action. The real takeaway here is that I think in a lot of cases where they were getting access to credentials, those credentials did not have phishing-resistant MFA. So either they had, let's say, SMS-based multi-factor authentication, which you could use a SIM swap to get around, or no multi-factor authentication at all, which meant that once they had that credential, they could use that credential from anywhere in the world. If you're based in the United States, or you're based in the UK, and someone uses your credentials from Thailand, that's usually a pretty suspicious gap. And the best way to prevent that from happening, obviously, if it's through the application itself, you can kind of detect those things. But as the end user, the best thing that you can do is implement phishing-resistant MFA, which really just means having a hardware token. If you use SMS, or you use something even like an authenticator, there is some risk that someone can convince you to give them that authenticator code. Whereas if you have something like a YubiKey or a Google Titan FIDO key, you can prevent the possibility that someone's able to get around that multi-factor authentication, because they actually need that physical device to do it. Another example, another thing to keep in mind here is when we talk about flaws in your recovery process, making sure that you are thinking as strongly about how you recover your account as you do about authenticating. So obviously you have your username, your password, your whatever other factors you may add, like a FIDO key, but you also want to make sure that the recovery process, in case you lose access, does not bypass all of those things. So you want to make sure that the recovery process is, one, something that you understand. Hey, where is if I lose my password to that account, where is the email going to go when I hit forgot password? Is that email account protected to the same degree as the main account that I'm concerned about? Is it phone number based? Is the backup for that account a phone number that could then be SIM-swapped to take over that account? Because a lot of times recovery processes by design will bypass your multi-factor authentication in some cases, because the idea is that maybe you lost your key or you no longer have access, and so the application is trying to help you get back in, and you just want to make sure that the avenues to get back in that via that method are, one, things that you understand, but also are protected to the same degree as the original account. And then obviously you have the biggest one, which is phishing. That's kind of the main way that people get in. In August 2018, the World Anti-Doping Agency was targeted by Russian actors who were trying to get insights into athlete testing and whether or not there were athletes who had tested for using performance-enhancing drugs. It's well known from investigations that they primarily relied on spear phishing, and so creating deceptive mechanisms to target the people at the World Anti-Doping Agency and get into those organizations. Again, this is another case where if there was more phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication and potentially a malware solution for anything that was delivered after the fact, that would have helped to prevent this. With all of these things, by the way, when I say what would have helped prevent, I just want to clarify, it's not saying that this is 100% this silver bullet that would have completely prevented this. But if these things were in place, it would have made it probably much harder for the actors behind this to complete these attacks. And I wanted to keep hitting on those themes of making sure you're using phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication and anti-malware solutions in the case where you do see criminal groups or government-backed groups using actual malware to accomplish their campaigns. So coming back to kind of the beginning again, knowing yourself, understanding what you have is important, your funds, your data, and your access. The starting point for a lot of this is really just sitting down and thinking, hey, if I have access to significant funds, where are those funds? How protected are those accounts? When it comes to data, understanding both which applications and services do I use that have my data, whether that's something like perhaps your Gmail if you use Google email for your email, or your Proton Mail if you use Proton. Things like your file sharing, whether that's OneDrive or Google Drive, or even Proton has, I think, like a Drive-based file sharing. Understanding, hey, where is my data? And then for all the places that there's stuff I care about, maybe you're using Google Drive, but you don't put anything sensitive on it. That's okay. Maybe it's okay to have something that's not as protected because you don't put anything sensitive there. But just understanding what is sensitive to me, what's important to me, what would I be concerned about if I lost it, and then where am I putting that, both in terms of external third-party applications and services, but also devices. Are you putting that stuff on your phone? Are you putting that stuff on your laptop? And are you thinking about those things as having the same risk as you would those services that are in the cloud potentially? And then access, it really is valuable, I think, to think about not only the organizations you work for and partner with, who maybe someone will target you for the organization you work for. That's, I think, probably the most front of mind. But also think about the relationship you have, the people your friends, your business partners, your colleagues. Think about the fact that if someone is targeting a friend of yours who works at a very important company or has a company with critical access or an organization with critical access, maybe they will target you to get to that friend. Also think about people around you that may be in that scenario. So in some cases, you'll see threat groups targeting parents. You'll see in some cases where maybe you have a couple and they're both on the same cellular plan, where in order to get the authorization they need for a SIM swap, instead of targeting the actual individual they're going after, they'll call the spouse. They'll try to convince the spouse. They'll send a text, to the spouse saying, hey, I lost my phone and I need your help, and creating a sense of urgency around that. So really just doing that internal audit around where are the things that are important to me and how protected are they, and specifically when it comes to access and the people around you, having conversations in some cases with family members, with friends, where you can say, hey, I'm never going to call you and ask you to do something super super urgent, like wire me a bunch of money. And if I do, it's probably not going to be a brand new account that you've never seen before. And so you'd think that those would be common sense things, but a lot of times when it comes to phishing and social engineering, they're creating a sense of urgency with people to make them feel like, oh, I have to do this thing. So as far as kind of going there, what you want to do, protecting yourself, I'm a big believer that the best thing that anyone can do is really apply MFA to as many things as they possibly can. If you can, use a hardware MFA using something like a YubiKey. That's what's pictured here, or any other FIDO2 compliant hardware multi-factor authentication provider. If you can't do that, I would say that an authenticator-based app, like something like Google Authenticator or Authy or Duo, are the kind of the next best thing. You really do want to avoid SMS MFA if at all possible. I would say at this point, SMS MFA is almost as bad as no MFA. I suppose it is technically better than nothing, but it does come with a number of challenges with it that I think if you can enable something stronger, you want to do that, and you want to do that for accounts that are sensitive or important. I think that it doesn't have to apply in every case. You may have accounts that you don't care about. Maybe for your local coffee shop, there's they have a website and where you can place your favorite orders and makes it easier to reorder. Maybe you don't necessarily need MFA on that because there's nothing really sensitive about that except maybe your payment information. Maybe you don't need to be that strict about it, but certainly for something like your email, so your social media accounts, your bank, most banks these days will require you to have some kind of MFA, but they may not require hardware MFA. That said, they might offer that as an option. So you definitely want to consider, if you do have a YubiKey, where can you apply that just to get that next level of security? Secondly, I think protecting your accounts is a very big one. If nothing else, you at least want to sit down and just think through what are all the accounts that have the sensitive data, and what protects them. And in particular, I think it's a good idea to make sure that SMS is not a critical part of those recovery processes, just because we have seen, particularly in the United States, how common and easy it is for criminal groups to convince an employee working at a random store somewhere at an outlet to reset a SIM swap. And that's by design to some extent. If you are traveling or you're in a situation where you have lost your phone and you do want to get back up and running, the incentive for those carriers and those providers is to get you back up and running. And so that's part of why it is so easy, because that sense of urgency can be used to manipulate someone into making changes. So you just want to make sure that you're aware, hey, where's the exposure there? What potentially is an issue there? I think talking to your emergency contacts or joint account owners, if you share a plan or you share in some cases the ability of a shared account owner to reset certain criteria, just have that conversation to make sure you both understand, hey, we may be targeted for not just because of what we know and what we have, but also for people we interact with, and making sure that you've understood how protected are these accounts. Maybe even talking as far as saying, hey, here's our procedure when we're talking to each other about how we're going to do these things, so that some person who doesn't know you can't come in and convince either of you, because you already established beforehand the way that we're going to do this is this way. The next thing is keeping software up to date. It's something that I think a lot of people, ideally, you just have it turn on to automatic and you just let it run. Unless I think only in very few situations is it the case that you probably should hold off on updates. But generally speaking, for most people, when you get security updates from your operating system, from your phone, you just want to apply those as soon as possible. I would say especially for your operating system and particularly your browser, because you do see a pretty steady stream of browser exploits being used to gain access to people's devices. You want to make sure that you have those updates turned on. In some cases, you may not want to have them turned on because of compatibility with certain software, but I would say if you don't know specifically of a scenario where that's true, lean in the direction of just having the automatic updates on so that things will, so you'll get those security updates applied. The next one would be anti-malware solutions. I would say at a minimum, you want an anti-malware solution that can detect, that can do file-based detection. It's not the best thing in the world, but it is better than literally nothing. And in some cases, it will catch things. Surprisingly, they will catch things. I would say even better, you want a solution that does behavioral detection. Something like Microsoft Defender, Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike, they're all examples of ones that do have some kind of behavioral component. And what that means is, with file-based detection, it's if there's a specific type of malware that's delivered to you, it can detect it based on that. Hey, we saw this file before, we know it's malicious. With behavior, it's maybe the specific files being used are not files we've seen before, but there's certain actions that are being taken. A great example would be if you plug a USB in, and then that plugging it in causes some kind of execution. That is not what normally happens when USBs get plugged into your computer. That's the kind of behavioral detection. Well, maybe they haven't actually seen the payload itself that was being delivered, but the action of executing something off of USB as soon as you plug it in is strange enough that it would notice that and potentially flag it. I would say best of all, make sure you have someone who knows what to do if the solution does detect something. I think step one is having a solution in the first place that will do the detection. I think by default, in a lot of cases on modern Windows, you'll have Defender in place, and it's pretty decent. Make sure you're not turning off all of the settings for Defender or turning off things like tamper protection. I would say on an Apple device, while there isn't a operating system level software that that you can implement. Apple does not provide their own, built-in malware detection suite, but you can turn on something like lockdown mode. And what lockdown mode will do is it will make it much harder for someone to just take an exploit and throw an exploit at you. Apple already does a pretty good job with their anti-exploitation protections, but lockdown mode takes that one step further and makes it just that much harder for someone to get around those protections. That said, you can also get, in some cases, security software for Apple devices as well, which at a minimum will help you detect those things. If nothing else, you want to have that there where maybe you're not actively tracking it, but if something bad does happen, or you're like, hey, I got compromised in some way, it was there. And so maybe it does have a log of things that it saw that you can use to piece together what the impact might have been. And then kind of lastly, just being vigilant. The biggest thing to understand with phishing is that phishing is always going to be something unsolicited. You probably did not initiate the communication. And then it's going to try to create a sense of urgency. Someone is going to be coming to you and saying, oh my gosh, I need you to do this right now. A common example from criminal groups is you receive a text message from someone claiming to be your boss who says, hey, I need you to go to an Apple store and get me some Apple gift cards. It's super urgent. I can't do it right now. I'm in a business meeting. There's a few ways to think about that. One is, has your boss ever done that before? If not, it's probably not legitimate. But if that is the kind of behavior that you do need to have with your organization, talk about that beforehand, to talk about what are the procedures for doing this. Understanding that if you get an unsolicited call to do something that is urgent, if you don't know that person, it's definitely suspicious. If you do not know that person, ask yourself, hey, is this something that I think they would normally do? And don't be afraid to independently check things. I think if you get into the habit of independently checking things, you will be in a much better state. So for example, if I get a text message from a friend and they say, hey, I need you to do something that's super urgent, maybe I'm fine with just picking up the phone and calling them. Hey, let me call you to make sure. If you get an email from that looks like it's coming from an application you use, like, hey, your account's been compromised, click here to reset your password. In some cases, the best idea maybe not be to click that link, but to just go independently visit the site. Okay, Facebook is telling me that my account is compromised, or Twitter is telling me that my account is compromised, I should reset my password. Rather than click the link, I will just go directly to Twitter. I will go directly to Facebook. I will go to the site I know how to reach myself, and then I will do it that way, as opposed to clicking the link in the email. Little things like that can go a long way towards making sure that when you do see something that's urgent, that might actually be concerning. If you got an email saying, hey, you're from your bank or from an application like your social media that says, hey, you've been compromised, that's very concerning. You do want to fix that. One way that you can make sure that you're not getting phished is just go directly to the site. Don't use the link in the email. And then lastly, trust your gut. I think most of us have pretty good instincts. If something seems off, even just a little bit, don't take a sensitive action. Maybe it's fine. Again, if it's something that's as simple as like, hey, can you buy me a coffee? Well, what at the end of the day, if you buy a coffee for someone and it wasn't the right person, that's not the biggest deal. But it's like, hey, wire me $100,000. If you're not sure, something seems off, don't do it. Don't do it. Be sure that you're willing to double check. And I think those kinds of practices will help you to be in a really good spot. It can be difficult if your job, or as a matter of practice, you have to basically talk to strangers all the time. But I think that's where just being careful about how much urgency they place on that, and having a set of procedures for yourself around, if I receive files from someone I don't know, I take exactly these steps every single time. I make sure to do it on a computer I don't care about. I make sure to, that I have an anti-malware solution on that computer. And between all these different things, you should be in a pretty good spot to not end up being completely owned. So that's kind of the bulk of it. I guess we'll open it up for questions here, but that's the presentation.
That was awesome. Yeah, for anyone watching, if you've got a question, feel free to pop it in the replies on the Twitter post. But a question from my side, Dan, that from an individual point of view, like that, both the first slide and that last slide kind of condensed everything really well. How would you recommend from an organizational point of view, what are the top 4, in 60 seconds kind of tips on an organizational level that businesses can take to kind of make sure that their OpSec is solid?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it's essentially the same, but the difference on an organizational level is how do you enforce it, right? So
Okay.
on the individual level, you can go through your accounts and you can make sure you have something like hardware MFA. On an organizational level, you really want to ask that question of, can we enforce it? And or at the strictest sense, can we enforce it? But in a more loose sense, how do we know if our users are doing this? At a minimum, you want to have the visibility to understand, hey, are our employees, are the members of our organization doing these things? Where the organization can do it for them, I think that's where the organization can really do a lot of good for those people, is especially for organization-based assets, making sure that you're kind of enforcing it, making sure you enforce multi-factor authentication. You have strict procedures around recovery. In the case of device management and device-based threats, making sure that You have specific procedures for how people are going to use devices to access your information. As much as everyone hates having multiple devices, I do think in some cases just having a separate one for the sensitive stuff is probably the best way to go. But really, for an organization, it just comes around, I think, the logistics of making sure that what needs to be done on an individual level is done across the organization.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Let me just check. Let me change tabs and see if there are any questions in the chat. Cool. Doesn't look like there are any. But maybe one additional question from my side. Obviously, we're in the Web3 space, and there's a lot of chat about smart contract security and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
How, and this is more of like a existential question, I guess. But how do you think we kind of help the narrative along of people, of getting, the industry as a whole to understand that, things like smart contract security are super important, but things on this level are equally important. How do you think we kind of shuffle that along?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that I don't think people in Web3 should feel as if they are behind in some ways, because I do think to some extent these challenges are challenges everyone faces. So I think, for one, not understanding that it's not like things are especially bad for Web3 in terms of how well everyone is doing. I do think that in some cases in Web3, maybe the biggest thing is just to understand that you do have a nation state that is targeting things that in other industries you don't necessarily see nation states participating at as low a level, right? A lot of times when you see more traditional industries, the nation state involvement is around work that governments are doing and kind of adjacent to government work. But in the case of Web3, a lot of Web3 products are not associated with any government. They're not, they don't have the kinds of resources that a government can bring to bear. And yet you still have governments like the North Korean government, in some cases the Iranian government, that are taking specific actions that are against them. They're using, the full weight that a nation state offensive apparatus might use. And so I think that helping people to understand, like, if you are in a protocol or a project that has lots of funds, or you have a high TVL, you probably are a target of that nation state. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect against the things that are successful, right? In some cases, you do see them targeting smart contract security as how they're successful, but also we see lots and lots of cases where they're not targeting smart contract security. They're doing, basic, run-of-the-mill phishing, trying to take over Discord accounts, trying to get people to click links that look like other things. And so I think just making sure that within Web3, there's kind of a discipline that's built up, the same discipline you would apply to your on-chain activity, applying that to your off-chain activity. And I would say that to some extent, Web3 is ahead from a mentality perspective, because I think for the most part, if you are using, especially if you've been using crypto for a while, kind of that there are trapdoors. And so, and kind of what you need to do on the on-chain stuff. And so just applying that, hey, just because you've gone off-chain doesn't mean you can suddenly stop thinking about, right? It doesn't mean you can stop thinking about whether or not you're validating what you're looking at, and understanding that one of the benefits of decentralization is that you get the eyeballs of the crowd, on transactions in order to validate what's going on. You don't necessarily have that in Web 2, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't, right? And so I think also understanding that to the extent that you're sharing information with one another and you're tracking to the best of your ability, hey, what's going wrong? What is everybody seeing? And then just applying, the basic protections that, every single one of these attacks that you see happening, in some cases where credentials are stolen, it's like if there was multi-factor authentication, it might have prevented that. So I think it's really just about applying that same level of scrutiny to off-chain activity as to on-chain activity, in the same way that you might use a multi-sig wallet for large transactions for a DAO or for a big project. The equivalent of that for authentication in Web 2 is having multiple factors. You have your username and your password, which is one factor, and then you have, your hardware token, which is the second factor. You could look at that as being, that's a 2 out of 3 multi-sig for getting into that account. So just applying that same principle to the Web 2 side, I think, is how you can help increase that adoption and awareness.
I love that. We've got one question from the audience. What are your thoughts on personal defense tech? For example, your own personal LLM taking care of your OpSec.
Your own personal LLM? I think so LLMs are, from my understanding, generative models. So I don't know that they're as good at, kind of the traditional, maybe more traditional ML would be suited for, which is pattern detection and anomaly detection. I think if it works, it's great. I think if it's the big question with any defensive tooling is, does it work? And that's where, even anti-malware solutions, if something is truly novel, they're all going to fall apart in some cases. And for things that are not novel, they all have strengths and weaknesses. So you kind of always have to evaluate whatever solution you're using from a personal detection and defense perspective. The big question is it working?
Yeah.
Chances are, if it's able to catch the basic stuff and you're seeing it catch the basic stuff, then that's probably mostly what you have to worry about. The downside being that for something that is truly novel, you wouldn't necessarily know unless it's being used against you and you're catching it to some degree. So there's a bit of a chicken and the egg there. Of, is it being effective, or is it because no one is targeting you, or is it you think it's being effective, but it's not being effective because you are being targeted and compromised, and you just don't know because it's not effective. That's kind of the perpetual challenge. But I do think that if you're able to bring something like AI to bear, if it works, it can be very good, and it can give you an advantage, because then it means that you're not having to spend a human's effort and time tracking something, and also from a pattern detection perspective, and being able to identify anomalies in big sets of data. That's where machine learning and AI can really come into play.
Awesome. Cool. I hope that answers that question. I don't think there are any else from the audience, but this was super useful, and I really appreciate you taking the time. For anyone who didn't get to catch it, I'll be uploading this to the Cantina YouTube channel probably by the end of the day, so you can scroll up then as well.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Dan.
No problem. Anytime.